Hello, welcome to Teaching His Story. This is Dr. Brenda MacMenamin. Let's talk about the Constitution. I'm going to share some things about our Constitution that you may not know, and I learn what people don't know when I talk to people, and they look at me and they say, I've never heard that before. So I'm going to kind of dig into my memory and share some of the things that people have said to me. I've never heard that before. Okay. So, one of the things is that the Declaration of Independence laid the groundwork for the Constitution. So, to go back and give you a little bit of historical perspective, you had so many of the colonists came over in the 1600s and developed their own state governments, 12 out of the 13 of them in the 1600s. And so by the 1750s and the 1760s, with King George III, when he began to tyrannize them, they had been governing themselves at that point for decades and for generations, as far back as some of them could remember. And so what he would do, and different kings did this over that period, where they'd be governing themselves, they'd have their own House of Representatives, their own method of making laws, their own method of taxing themselves, and then paying him those taxes. And he would wipe out their self-government and send over one of his pets, literally, to be the governor and just wipe out everything the colonists knew and loved in governing themselves. And so in the 1730s, we had a great awakening, and it was a time of revival and reformation, and people became very in love with the Lord. Benjamin Franklin said you couldn't walk down the street without hearing someone worshiping God in their homes. So out of that, they learned how to reason from the Bible to every area of their lives, even their civil responsibilities. So the generation from that generation is the Founding Fathers generation. So they had founding fathers that reasoned from the Bible, not only their parents and the culture in America, but also in England with John Locke, John Robinson, Thomas Hooker, William Ames, some of the patriots and solid biblical worldview Christians, as they would read the Bible and apply those biblical principles of self and civil government to different essays that they wrote. And so our founding fathers reasoned from the Bible toward their civil government responsibilities. But when the king began to tyrannize them, they began to unite together for their common defense and general welfare, so that they could literally get through his tyranny. And when they were appealing to him, they had to make a decision, because they knew when they signed that Declaration of Independence that it would be considered treason. And the king had a vast naval, the most mighty military power on earth at that time was England, and America was just fledgling businesses and farmers, and yet they did unite together. And so when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, you see in that very first paragraph, it says, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. So that is referring to God. I used to always hear laws of nature. I didn't know what that meant, but it means that you can so observe God's principles in nature that you can see the laws of nature just by observing, but they're God's laws. And it says, and of nature's God. Okay, so that's reading the Bible. So then in the next paragraph, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Okay, so they knew that we didn't just appear from evolution, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So our rights come from God. We don't get our rights from government. And that's really important to understand, because if government doesn't give us rights, then government can't take away our rights. And if you really consider the word rights, responsibility, when reading the quotes from the Founding Fathers, it's closer to how they meant the word rights. They were more concerned about reading the Bible and obeying it, and that was their responsibility. And they called that a right. And now we use the word right sometimes to mean license. What can we write a law to do to get away with something that is actually against God's law? Okay, that's not true law. That is license, and it's not what they meant when they said right. Okay, so, and it says that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Samuel Adams developed these concepts in an article that he wrote in 1772 when they were wrestling with some of these concepts. So Thomas Jefferson at this point is just summarizing a lot of what they had been talking about in the committees of correspondence and between the different states as they're wrestling with realizing if they didn't throw off the tyranny of the king, that their children would be slaves. And they would encourage each other to virtue, which is so refreshing. And it's very instructive to us today as we're under tyranny. We have to be careful that we don't respond or react, actually, isn't it, in anger, but that we are angry but sin not. Then that's righteous anger, and it's hard to do, and that's called virtue. When you know the right thing to do and you do it, that's virtue. So that's what God is developing in us right now, isn't he? It's amazing when you read the biographies and the autobiographies of the founders during this time, how parallel their situation was with what we're going through right now. And it really builds our faith that God's going to rescue us today. So then it says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, that summarizes a lot of the history, and specifically the part where it talks about consent of the governed. That was established in our very first state constitution, which was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, written by Reverend Thomas Hooker, based on Exodus 18:21 and Deuteronomy 1:13. I go into that in other lessons in my American history and then in my American government class. So if you want more information on that, go to teachinghisstory.com and you can learn more about that in depth. But so you have this preamble, if you will, of the Declaration of Independence, and then you have the 27 grievances where they're appealing to the king. And they're saying he's refused his assent to laws, and it just goes right on down, saying all the injustices that they've suffered under him. And what's amazing is that in the original draft, there was a 28th grievance, and it was for slavery. Did you know that? It says he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating in its most sacred rights of life and liberty and the power of a distant people who never offended him, carrying and captivating them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. And you know, if you've studied slavery, that a lot of them did die in the ships on the way over. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers. Now that's specifically referring to the Dutch traders, the Muslims, where they would scoop up the black slaves and bring them over, not only to America, but to South America. That's where most of them went, was to South America. And so that's who that's referring to. In the warfare of the Christian king, that's underlined, of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for supporting every okay, so then he's going into something different. But I wanted you to know that one of their original grievances was trying to end slavery, and the king would veto it. He had veto power similar to our executive branch now, and so he made it difficult for them to end it. And so you have all of these grievances, and then at the very end, they're appealing to the supreme judge of the world. Now, they had learned that from John Locke in Of Civil Government, that when you have a tyrannical king, you must resist his tyranny, but you can never aggressively go after him. And if you've exhausted every attempt at an appeal, then your only recourse is to appeal to the supreme judge of the world. And that's where we got our very first American flag, which is that appeal to heaven flag. I'm sure you've seen it with the evergreen tree on it. So that's quite a bit of history there. It's really fascinating. Okay, so at the very end, they're saying, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Isn't that beautiful? So the point I want to make in all these grievances, when you read Common Sense, which was published by Thomas Paine in January of 1776, and that kind of rallied all the colonists together, and he challenged them that whole divine right of kings concept that they were laboring under was not biblical. And he used scriptures from Judges with Gideon and 1 Samuel 8. And what's amazing is that if you read it, remember that section where the nation of Israel tells the prophet Samuel, we want a king so we can be like the other nations. We want a king to fight our battles for us. And so Samuel goes to God and he says, they've rejected me. And God says, they haven't rejected you. They've rejected me, that I wouldn't be king over them. And then he says, you tell them I'm going to give them a king, but when I give them a king, he's going to take their sons, he's going to take their daughters, he's going to take their land, he's going to make them pay high taxes. And he goes down this whole list. And you'd think at the end of that the nation of Israel would say, we've made a mistake. We repent. We don't want a king. But they said, nevertheless, we want a king to fight our battles for us. And so America is the nation that said, no, we don't want a king. We want King Jesus. And their battle cry actually during the American Revolution was no other king but King Jesus. Isn't that beautiful? And so when you read these 27 grievances and you read what God told Samuel to tell the men of Israel the king would do, they're very similar. It's really amazing. Okay, and so then you have that covenant at the end. They're mutually pledging their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. So what they did when they wrote the Constitution, which has such rich history, just the fact that they got there was so miraculous. They had 50 attempts to have a constitution written and pulling the states together to make them a nation. 50 attempts. Isn't that amazing? So it was quite an accomplishment. But just to kind of give you an overview of what the Constitution actually has in it, because a lot of people have no idea. I ask people, how many articles are in the Constitution? And they say 27, which that's not the articles, that's the amendments. And, don't feel bad if you don't know. We don't know because we have intentionally been not taught in the public school. And if you know the history of the public school and how it was started by the humanists, the Marxists, the Masons, whatever you want to call them. There's different people, but they were all with the same intent to be anti-Christ and rob us of our heritage. And so what we're going to do now is kind of give you an overview and just kind of a little bit into each one. And then if you want more information on this, I have a 6-week course. It's about 2 hours each class, and it'll be online. I offer it at different times. I keep continually offer it. So you can go to teachinghisstory.com and then scroll down until you see Constitutional Conversations in 6 weeks. And I hope you join us because it is just amazing. Every time I teach it, I get to learn from the people that take it with me. It's very conversational. And so if this sounds interesting, please join us and we'll go more into depth. So you have this beautiful preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So at that point, they were under the Articles of Confederation, which they knew was woefully inadequate to the exigencies of their government. It had no executive. It had no federal judiciary. It didn't give Congress the power to tax. And so they were suffering under the Articles. And that's why during the American Revolution, the soldiers starved and froze to death. They didn't have the guns that they needed. They didn't have the clothes that they needed. They didn't have the food that they needed. And to tax the colonists, they virtually had to declare war on them. And it was a mess. The states couldn't trade amongst each other. So that's actually, the commerce is actually what brought them to the Constitution. They knew they needed a more perfect union. That's what this is referring to. Establish justice. They wanted a place where they could complain about their injustices and have them heard and have a speedy trial. Ensure domestic tranquility. They needed a break from chaos. As I said, they couldn't trade amongst the states, and they did not believe in a democracy. Federalist 10 says a democracy is as short in its life as it is violent in its death. So they knew they needed a written constitution that would make everyone equal under law. And that's called a Republican form of government. Not to be confused with the Republican Party, but it is a Republican. We are a constitutional republic, a written law, and we're all equal under the law. Ensure domestic tranquility. So they wanted a way to trade between the states and have that peace, which they didn't have at the time. Provide for the common defense. They knew that if they didn't pull together, that England, Spain, France, some of the other countries would pick them off state by state, divide them against each other, and be able to defeat them. Promote the general welfare. Now, this is really interesting because every law that was passed went through the House and the Senate. And before the 17th Amendment, the House represented the people and the Senate represented the states. And so that made every law that was passed be approved by the representatives of the people and the representatives of the states, ensuring that it was for the general welfare, never specific welfare like we have constantly now, don't we? And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. They were really good fathers, weren't they? Aren't you glad they cared about us, their posterity? So then it closes, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now that was proposed by Governor Morris because he was concerned that we wouldn't know what the Constitution was about. Very insightful, wasn't he? Okay, so then you see you have 7 articles. Okay, that's the Constitution. It has 7 articles. And what's fascinating is that in this little pocket Constitution, the Constitution starts on page 1, Article 1, and then the second article starts on page 9, which means, and so then the whole Constitution goes to page, I think it's like 16. Yes. Okay, so 16. So half of the Constitution would be page 8. And the second article starts on page 9. So the first half of the Constitution is Article 1. Now, what's amazing about Article 1, 2, and 3 is they're the 3 branches of government. And if you didn't know, I think this is so fascinating. The founders got that concept from Montesquieu, who got it from the Bible. In Isaiah 33:22, the Lord says that he's our judge, our king, and our lawgiver. And then it says he will save us. And so the founders knew that God was fine with all that power, but when they gave or delegated some of their power to elected representatives, they wanted that power divided, not only into 3 branches, but then on the federal level and the state level, and then again in the local level. Isn't that fascinating? So the Article 1, which deals with the legislative branch, and then Article 2 is the executive branch, Article 3 is the judicial branch. And you see how important and carefully they delegated their legislative authority, because whoever can make laws carries an enormous amount of power. So they gave the representatives that have that authority only 2 years, and they're elected directly by the people. Isn't that fascinating? So they kept them on a very short cord. And so you see Article 1. Okay, I'll let you look at that or take the course to get more information. So Article 2 is the executive. Now, what's fascinating is we expect the president to do about 20 different things as far as being over agriculture and employment and education and all these things. None of those are constitutional responsibilities. Isn't that fascinating? He only has 6 enumerated powers in the Constitution. So I'm not going to go into that. Again, it's fascinating though. And then you see in Article 3 is the delegated authority for the Supreme Court and for the state courts. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is when it talks about their tenure being during good behavior, we tend to think that as long as they're not absolute criminals, then they're conducting themselves in good behavior. But actually what good behavior meant was according to the Constitution. Keeping the original intent of the Constitution is good behavior. And you know who really makes that very clear is David Barton in Restraining Judicial Activism. He cites his sources so well, doesn't he? So that's another resource if you want to study that more. Fascinating. Another fun fact about Article 3 is that when you read, I can't remember if it's Algernon Sidney, I think it's Montesquieu, he talks about what happens if 2 of the branches of government start colluding. So we have that massively right now. But he was explaining how with the court that there should be fixed law, but the men on the court aren't necessarily fixed. We have just the opposite now. We have them writing law, so the law isn't fixed, and they're in there for life. And so Thomas Jefferson actually proposed an amendment to the Constitution putting term limits on the Supreme Court justices. Isn't that interesting? If you want to contemplate that more with people that are contemplating that already, join conventionofstates.com. Article 4, Section 4, it says, United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. Now, again, that's not the Republican Party, but it's the concept of having written law, having representatives, and having everyone, the representatives and the people, equal under law. We've lost that concept and we need to get it back, don't we? Then Article 5, speaking of Convention of States, is the amendment process. So you have the 27 amendments we have presently have all been proposed by Congress. We don't have any that have been proposed by the states. But as we've watched the federal branches collude and we're under so much tyranny right now, the founders knew that we would probably be in this situation. You can read their quotes. And, if you read the Federalist Papers, the Constitutional Convention debates, they talked about this and the need to have the amendment process be proposed by the states. And so that's what Convention of States is. And it requires 34 states to call for a convention. And then amendments are proposed, debated, and then the ones that they finalize among themselves go back to the states for ratification. And 38 states have to ratify each amendment for it to actually amend the Constitution. So it's very difficult, very hard, and we want it that way because we don't want the Constitution amended for light and transient causes, right? Okay, so then in Article 6, they talk about how to pay off the debts. And then in Article 7, it was the ratification process. And because they had 50 attempts to come to the Constitutional Convention, they had the call for a convention in Annapolis, and only 5 states showed up. And so they knew at that point that contrary to their intention in the Articles of Confederation in Article 13, it had required a unanimous vote to be able to amend the Articles of Confederation. But by the time they got to the Constitutional Convention, they didn't want it to be unanimous because they called it the tyranny of one state that might not agree or might not even show up. And so they decided to have not only a ratification for the Constitution based on 3/4 of the states, but then the Constitution would only be for those states that had ratified. And so that forced the last few states to actually ratify the Constitution, because they just treated Rhode Island, they called her Rogue Island, because she just wasn't motivated to come in. And then she began to realize that she had to be part of the nation and to be part of America. So isn't that fascinating? I hope you enjoyed that. And, it's just a brief overview. You can see I'm not an expert. I'm still learning myself. But what a heritage we have. And, our Constitution is based on biblical law from these founding fathers of our founding fathers that read the Bible and deduced principles and shared them with people of how we could be the most free and honor God. And God honored us, didn't he? So let's get back to his word. Let's get back to him. Let's get back to the original intent of the Constitution so that we can honor him and glorify him and have freedom once again. Thanks for joining me. God bless y'all. If you'd like to join us for the next Constitutional Conversations in 6 weeks course, please go to teachinghisstory.com, or you can scan this QR code. Hope to see you then. God bless y'all.